Sermon titled, I Do Not Know. Right. The passage we just read is really a famous one, and as we just sang too, this phrase, Christ in me, is to live, to die gain. It's really well-known passage for us, and people will use this passage to emphasize this Christ who lives us, and the value of Christ lives in us, so he can make everything good for his kingdom and his people. But today's message is also about decision making and hearing God's voice. We'll see about that. In today's passage, Paul says something very strange. In verse 22, he says, I do not know. So it's very strange, because in all his letters, Paul gives answers. Paul explains God's will very clearly, and he communicates with certainty. But now here he says, I do not know. This is very rare for him to say. So he is in between two situations. What to choose? To die or to live? And he says, I do not know which one is better. And before the earlier passage, he was also in between, because his situation in prison became a challenge for one group and a stumbling block for another group. And both groups used Paul's chain for the advancement of the gospel. And he was torn between the two. Which one is God's will? And he says, he does not know. We're in this situation of life, Christian life. We do not know which one is God's will. I am in a situation and I see which option is God's will. And I say, I do not know. But in Christian life, you also hear some people claim they have heard the voice of God very clearly. I don't know how you feel about that, but I was both envious and critical. When I was very cynical, I used to ask them, you say you heard God's voice. Are you saying that you heard it as an audible voice? Or are you saying that you have an idea? If you heard it as an audible voice, how do you know if it was God's voice or the Satan playing tricks on him? Now looking back, my cynicism was kind of partly envy. I thought, I didn't hear it, I did not voice, I never heard the voice of God. If God spoke, why did I not hear it and him? Why did it work so well for that person? And if God does speak, why have I not heard it before? Why does God speak to that person so often? And comparing him to me, he doesn't seem so much better than me. It cannot be, because his hearing is done literally. It was kind of envy and jealousy that criticized that person that he heard the voice of God. And then secondly, there was a relevant criticism because of the harm and danger to the Christian community when one person or two people, they claim they hear God's voice. When you say God said in a Christian community, we know that it's going to be taken more seriously because of its spiritual weight. You can't just laugh about when one person said he heard God saying. And people in the community are going to be more likely to be drawn to those things. And what if they claim is false and wrong? Then the danger is very big. So I have resistance for those who claim to have heard the voice of God. And over the years, there are a few things that I learned about the voice of God. First, despite my own resistance and lack of experience, I learned that it is possible for God to speak in a voice. This applies to other spiritual gifts as well, where people, myself included, tend to deny what they have not experienced. So it's a mentality that says, I do not believe it until I see it with my own eyes. We have an example in the Bible, Thomas, one of Jesus' disciples. He said, I will not believe him until I see him with my own eyes. Until I touch it with my own hands, he said. But as Jesus said to Thomas, he said, blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. So about spiritual things and spiritual world is not a humble way to assume that something does not exist just because it has not happened to me. Just because I have not experienced, we cannot deny the spiritual things. God can work supernaturally now as He did in the biblical times. Because He is still a living and active God. And it is not wise to deny that He works in ways that we humans can hear and experience. So this is the first thing I learned. I still do not hear God's voice, but I acknowledge that it is possible for God to speak nonetheless. However, secondly, I learned that we believers should use the expression voice of God very carefully. Because the voice of God that many people say they heard is actually often non-verbal. It is usually an idea that God puts in their mind during prayer, or something they hear from someone else, or through a book or a situation they look at and think, I think it is God's will. Of course, it could be God's voice, because if you've done something you would never have done under normal circumstances, or you hear something unexpected in a conversation with someone you never thought you would hear. So it is not wrong to say that you heard God's voice. You want to say you heard God's voice because this thing you cannot explain. Imagine a person whose first value in life is money. In one day, during a conversation with someone in need financially, he suddenly feels compelled to share his money, and he did not feel like it was a waste, but rather his heart was filled with joy. How else can we explain this radical change of heart from money to sharing, other than God's voice? So we can say that even this non-verbal communication of God is what God said. So we say God's voice emphasizes the important change in life. But it is possible for our mutual benefit. It would be wiser to say, I felt this way in prayer, or I have this conviction, or I think this is God's will, instead of saying I heard God's voice. This way of saying is necessary because of the weight of the word, voice of God has, and the danger it can cause in Christian communities. Third, I learned that the voice of God, whether spoken or unspoken, comes in many ways. God's voice is diverse in its way and diverse in its content. So first, there are many ways God speaks to us. God speaks to us through situations. God speaks to us while we read the Bible, and we feel a certain way, and someone comes to mind in prayer, or we change our mind during conversation. All these ways are ways of God communicating, speaking to us. It comes in many ways. Next Sunday sermon is about God speaking through prayer, through the Word, through situation, and through church. And that's already a lot of ways. But this diversity of ways is not a problem in and of itself. Rather, this diversity enriches God's will and His voice, giving us a richer picture of many ways God works in our lives. It makes sense that God, the creator of all things, would reveal himself and his will in all kinds of ways. So diversity makes the revelation richer. In a loving relationship, it is not confusing to say, I love you with actions, with words, with gifts, with time. No one would complain will say I love you in so many ways because it is about enriching the message of love. The problem is that sometimes we get confused when these various voices seem to say different things. So rather than the diversity in the manner of God's voice, we are we are confused by the diversity in the content rather than the diversity in ways of God speaking. Chinese people say fear and shield when they say paradox. So Chinese saying fear and shield when they hear paradoxical things. It's from an ancient story. Once upon a time, a merchant was selling a spear that claimed to pierce everything, and a shield that claimed to block everything at the same time. So he sells a spear, he can pierce everything, and right next moment he moved the shield and can block everything. And the bystander said, let's see if you can pierce the shield with that spear. So when two statements are incompatible together, they say spear and shield. The reason why I say this was I had this experience in my life about spear and shield. When I was in college in Korea, it was a theological school. So the theology department was the largest and the main department. And there were Christian education department, history education department, English education department, and early childhood education department. In theology department, out of 100 people in the department, 95 were men. Only about 5 were women. On the other hand, the early childhood department had about 50 students. Almost all of them were women. So out of all the departments, the early childhood education department was the main target of the theology department, mostly men. So theology students did targeted prayer for girls they liked. And after a long prayer, they come to them and say, God has spoken to me. He wants me to date you or marry you. So they call it fear prayer. They thought they can break through everything with this prayer. Most people who do not fall for this kind of trick. It is very low trick. The problem is when this argument coupled with the phrase God said, it is not easy for a 19-year-old to laugh about it. So what did the sisters in early childhood education department do? They counter the spear prayer with the shield prayer in bigger groups. So if the spear prayer comes in one person praying, the shield prayer is done by 2 or 3. And they pray the shield prayer, and they say, God does not say that. And most of my theology classmates agreed and gave up. For me, this story is about an important decision and God's voice conflicting, and how we should discern when two voices seem to conflict. Question is, what do we do when we hear conflicting voices from God? What do we do when we do not know which of the two options is more God's will? Are we then likely to hear God's voice simply by praying longer and praying more often and more fervently? But if you look at the Bible, it doesn't seem to be a matter of quantity and frequency. The prophets of Baal quote Elijah on Mount Carmel. They prayed more, they prayed longer, and they prayed louder than Elijah. But it seems that discerning God's voice and hearing God's voice is not just a matter of quantity, time, and fervor. However, this is not a math problem where we can say, if this happens under these situations, then that is God's voice. You cannot say that. I used to think, I wish there was a formula for hearing God's voice and discerning God's voice. Why doesn't God just speak in a way that is very clear and obvious to everyone? And why does he make things so subtle and complicated? But when we consider that our relationship with God is a personal one, it is clear that the conversation that takes place in this relationship cannot be a formula. It is not a math problem. It is not a mechanical process. Think about your relationship with a loved one, your spouse, your children, your parents, and your family. In all of these relationships, we wish we could know the other person's mind clearly, without confusion. But we know it is not easy. Knowing a person's mind is a complicated process that happens in a long and personal relationship. It takes a lot of different ways of spending time and communicating. You have to see and interpret all the gestures, both verbal and nonverbal. It is only when we get past all these obstacles that we can fully hear what the other person means. There's a huge difference between understanding your spouse in the first year of marriage and understanding them in fifth and tenth year. To get to that level of understanding, you have to go through a long, deep, unspoken process of misunderstanding and understanding, of discernment of other person's will. God also communicates with us through many channels and in many ways. Then our job is to pay attention to each of these difficult ways, but never stop trying to hear and discern God's voice. Because in the end, what matters is not the content of what I heard from God's voice, but what kind of relationship we built with God through the process. So the priority is on relationships over content. We pray and we long to discern God's will clearly between A or B. But God pays more attention about the relationship we build through this conversation. We have this problem that we don't know which is God's voice and which is God's will between A and B. But thankfully, from this passage, Apostle Paul was in our situation too. Let me read our passage again. He begins verse 18 with this. But what does it matter? He asked this question to the Christian church. He says, the important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached. And because of this, I rejoice. He said that there are two different groups. One preaches the gospel out of false motives, and the other group preaches the gospel with true motives. This so now situation of Paul is he was in prison in Rome, writing this letter to the church in Philippians. He was in prison, and he saw his death is coming. Even in this situation, a group of Christians used this situation to talk bad about him. They blamed Paul being in prison, but they preached the gospel. It's very ironic. They preached the gospel, but they did this out of false motives. There was also a that better group who preached the gospel out of true motives. They were inspired by Paul's imprisonment, and they became braver. They got courageous, and they go out and preach the gospel. They thought, if Paul is in prison, we could do better. We could be more brave than him. So these two groups were they were in the same church, Philippi, and Paul heard this news. He was in between. Which one is God's will? Which one is God's voice? He may have wondered. But he said he will rejoice because Christ is faithful. He does not care whether this group is doing out of false motive or true motive. So his eye was on higher level because the gospel is preached. He was joyful. And he said he will continue to rejoice. For I know that through your prayers and gospel of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, what has happened to me will turn out for my deliverance. And he goes on to say, I eagerly expect and hope that I will in no way be ashamed, but will have sufficient courage, so that now as always Christ will be exalted in my body. And he says, whether by life or by death. So he has two struggles. First is two groups of people talking about him differently. And the other struggle he has to go through is for him, life or death, both seem fine. Because he knew that by life he will expand the kingdom of God. Even if he died, he knows that Christ is living in him. Die is pain. But the gospel is preached also. So he wondered, which one should I choose? Should I die or should I live? And he said, if I am to go on living in this body, this will mean fruitful labor for me. Yet, what should I choose? What shall I choose? And he said, I do not know. Because both options is very fine for him. Christ is preached, and it is gain whether he lives or dies. The last word is, I do not know. This is not what a new believer says, but the Apostle Paul, a man who has dedicated his life to Jesus. He says he doesn't know which one to choose. He doesn't know which one is God's will. Now, the Apostle Paul is writing to the church in Philippi from a prison in Rome only 4 years before his death. In this letter, he says that his imprisonment has had some positive and negative effects, emboldening some people to share the gospel, while others have said negatively about him. So it is hard to imagine, for us, but a group of Christians who were in competition with Paul took advantage of his hardship to criticize him when sharing the gospel. But when Paul hears all of this, his reaction was rejoicing. He rejoiced because whatever way is preached is Christ is. What is God's will in this situation? Is it God's will for them to be emboldened by Paul's imprisonment? Or is it God's will that they envy and challenge him? Here, we do not get an answer simply by asking A or B, because Paul provides a third way. He says whether it's A or B, Paul says Christ being Christian is the will of God. He doesn't mind the group of people who speak badly about him, but he also does not get fooled by the group of people who think and challenged by him. Because what is important thing is preaching the gospel. He wasn't just in prison. He saw his death was coming. Although he was released from prison where he wrote this letter, he did die in prison 3 years later. So in this difficult situation, Paul said to live or die. Whatever it is, it doesn't matter for him. His question in this situation is not whether to live or die, because he knows a better answer is to Christ is living in him. Paul knew that he will rejoice if he died. He knew that if he dies, he will rejoice because of the advancement of the gospel, because of his death. If he lives, he will still rejoice because of the progress of the gospel that will result from it. So faith, even with the question of to live or die, Paul's answer is, I do not know. This is not an answer of ignorance or confusion. Paul was not confused by this situation, but it is an answer of overcoming. He says, I do not know, because he overcame the situation of A or B. He overcame because he knew what is more important. For Paul, the advancement of the gospel, Christ's name being known, and our deepened relationship with God always comes first. In chapter 1, he keeps saying, whether I am in chains or defending. And he says later in verse 18, whether from false motive or truth. And in verse 20, he says, whether by life or by death, he doesn't care because he saw higher level of importance. He does not see life or death. He does not see the imprisonment or liberation as the answer. But his answer was the deeper relationship with God. Back to the spear and shield prayer. Which one is the voice of God? Which one is the will of God? We always ask this question, either A or B. Should I choose this job or that job? Should I choose this house or that house? Should I move or not? Should I do this or that? We always ask questions in this form, either A or B. But just like the Spirit and shield, we spend a lot of time in our life struggling this or that. However, as we see from Paul's example, God's voice and God's will does not come in A or B. In Paul's situation, God said, I don't care if you live or die. I don't care if you are in prison or free. Because the most important thing is the advancement of the kingdom and the gospel. And Paul knew that. Paul may have the same question like us, which one is God's will? But the answer is quite different. The reason why he says I do not know is because not because he does not know, but because he does not care whether he lives or dies. If life and death doesn't matter for him, everything else in his life doesn't matter. God's will is always on a higher level, the advancement of the kingdom of God and deeper relationship with God. Maybe you must be in a situation, you must have gone through this situation, you are struggling whether to choose this option or that option. You spend more and more and more time, you pray, but the end of the tunnel, you realize whether you chose A or B, both were not real. The important thing is we go deeper relationship with God. If we make better choice in not in relationship with God, they never be better. So let's say you got two options and one is clearly better than the other. But if you chose that better option, if you make a decision not with relationship with God, then it can never be a better option. It can never be a will of God. But if you chose the lesser option, if you did it in deeper relationship with God, spend time with God and try to discern His will, an intimate relationship, you chose a lesser option, it will never be a lesser option. It's always the will of God. A lot of situations in life is like that. We focus on this kind of thing, A or B. But God says, lift your eyes and look higher and pay more attention about the relationship we build with each other. And in this relationship, whether you choose A or B, it doesn't matter for me. Of course, here in the passage, Paul knew that which one is better. So when he says, I do not know, it doesn't mean that he doesn't know. He says simply he doesn't care. Verse 23, he says, I am torn between the two, and he says, I desire to depart, meaning death, and be with Christ, which is better by far. But it is more necessary for you that I remain in the body. And he knew that it's better by now to remain in the body, to remain with them. He had an answer. But when he said, I do not know, he means it. I do not care. But for the people who are in deeper relationship with Christ, they always have this attitude. A or B, I really don't care. Maybe A seems nicer than B. Maybe A can give me better financial benefits, but I really don't care if either A or B. Because this type of people knew that the most important thing is in relationship with God. You may be going through this situation that you have to choose, you have to make life decisions, A or B. But from God's perspective, Both are fine, and both can be bad depending on your relationship with God. The important thing is we remain in the deeper relationship with Him. The ultimate blessing. Paul knew this. Paul expressed this in a way that about extending the kingdom of God and make Christ's name be known. But it is also about our relationship with God. So let us not fix our eyes on these minor things, A or B. We can either choose this or that. But if you remain in God's relationship with God, deepening relationship, and constant communicating with Him, it becomes not an issue. Then you can boldly say, I do not know. Not because you do not know, but because you do not care. You care much, you care more about a higher level, God's relationship with you. It could be either individual or a group. So I pray that in your life situation, life decision, you have this attitude. I do not know. Not in a negative way, but positive way, because we do not care. Because our eyes is on relationship with God. That's what God wants in our life situation. He does not put us into this corner and make us choose between better or worse. He wants best for his children. He wants the best for his children, and all the riches of the relationship he wants to give to us, not this or that. So let us abide in this relationship. Let us seek a deeper relationship with him. And then the voice of God, we can hear him constantly, not in a way of A or B, but this in